Thank you for joining us with Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. Please send in your questions each week and we'll explore the history of the city of Mississauga together. Like, subscribe, and follow us, and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. For this week's episode, we'll be exploring some of the history of the village of Malton here in Mississauga. In researching and sharing the history of our wonderful city over the years, we've come to realize that there's really one area in particular in our city that kind of lacks assembled documentation, recorded oral histories, historic pictures, published materials, and that's Malton. It doesn't seem to have quite the rich gathered information that many of the other historic communities in Mississauga that are in Mississauga, like Streetsville and Port Credit and Arundel and Meadowvale and so on. Malton seems to have kind of a little bit of a dearth of collected information, and there's maybe a reason for this, almost kind of historically a forgotten part of our city in a sense, and we'll explore a little bit of that story today. Well, Malton certainly has had a number of published and unpublished histories over time, and these include A Study of Malton by Donald Paterson in 1957, Malton Memories, Pioneers to Airport by Angus Scully in 1981, and Malton, Farms to Flying by Kathleen Hicks in 2006. They all kind of hint at the same thing a little bit, and that is that there's a lot we don't know, or a lot that remains kind of uncertain or unrecorded about Malton's unique story. Certainly there are lots of stories we do know, of course, and we'll share some of those today, but there is so much more to learn about Malton. Malton was home to several historic newspapers over time, and really that helps record another unique part of Malton's history. They include the Malton Times in 1944, the Malton Pilot between 1969 and 1977, the Malton Courier around 1973 to 75, the Malton Mercury between 1977 and 1979, and the Malton Messenger between 1979 and 1980. And they all contributed to help identify kind of that unique chapter of what is the story of Malton. The Malton area began to see its first settlers in the 1820s, long before the city of Mississauga came to be, of course. And it is unclear when the name Malton actually became associated with the area, although if you read a lot of the local histories, it attributes the name of Malton to a little bit of a local legend named Richard Halliday, who reportedly, as a local blacksmith and involved in the community, helped to name the village after his birthplace. However, there's very little proof, if none, to actually support this beyond the name association itself. What we do know, kind of from a formal existence, so to speak, of the community of Malton, the name itself, Malton, came into existence with the registration of the town site survey by John Stout and Dennis on October 5th of 1855. And with the opening of the first post office a year later under Postmaster Isaac Sanderson in 1856, and there the name Malton was born, at least in terms of historic Mississauga. The town site, which is at the old town site of Malton, which is at the northwest corner of what is now Dairy Road and Airport Road. Dairy Road was originally surveyed as Holderness Street, but that's another story. At the northwest corner of Dairy Road and Airport Road, it was laid out as a railway town in conjunction with the Grand Trunk Railway development, which came through in 1856. The road network from the John Stout and Dennis survey, which was oriented to the railway and not to the cadastral grid system, is largely intact today, and it's a really unique part of Mississauga's identity in terms of our historic village core, because this is a village that was laid out as a railway town. The street names of Old Malton itself derive from place names in Yorkshire, England, as does the name Malton itself, of course. North Allerton, which is a misspelling of North Allerton in Yorkshire. Naysborough, which is also a different spelling variation to Naysborough in Yorkshire. Beverley, Harrow after Harrogate in Yorkshire. Scarborough, Studley, Studley named after Studley Royal Park in Yorkshire. Hull, named after Kingston upon Hull. Ripon and Catterick. Catterick is a name in Yorkshire as well. All confirm that the name Malton and the streets that form the old town site as it was surveyed in 1855 were inspired by the countryside of Yorkshire, England. Again, that's not really a kind of a new thing, but it does lend credence to the association that Malton as a name place came about in the 1850s, and that the story of Richard Halliday is a little bit more of a kind of an obscure legend, if you will. Malton, which was an unincorporated village in Toronto Township, applied to Peel County to become a police village in 1912, and the bylaw was passed by Peel County Council on January 30th of 1913. This might seem like a kind of a trifling bit of local history, but it was an important moment for the development of Malton, and something that Malton residents had long lobbied for, just a little bit of their own independence from the surrounding Toronto Township. But what is a police village, you might be wondering? A police village could be created through bylaw in a county when the population or finances of an area precluded an incorporation of the village. The county bylaw defined its geographic and political boundaries, and provided for an elected body of trustees, and allowed for the collection of funds, almost an informal tax levy. The police village could establish fire, police, and safety regulations, erect streetlights, improve roads and sidewalks, but otherwise the village remained part of the surrounding township. It was an uneasy marriage, with Malton seeking further independence at several times in its history, and we'll explore some of those a little bit later. The police village of Malton ceased with formal amalgamation of Toronto Township into the incorporated entity of the town of Mississauga in 1968. In an effort to uncover more of the story of Old Malton, we uncover names we know precious little about. Names like Isaac Sanderson and George Blaine. Who were they, and why did they come to own so many of the early village lots? And did they leave anything behind to help tell the story of Malton itself? There's a stunning historic house on Sledman Street that hints at a construction date prior to 1870. But who built it, and what was their story? The style of construction would suggest some level of prosperity. But it remains also a bit of a mystery, as do many other historic houses within the old Malton town site. The former Knox Presbyterian Church building and adjacent manse are now both private homes, surviving on Burlington Street. The old common laneways have provided carriage access points to the rear village lots, as surveyed by John Stout and Dennis in 1855, remain on the landscape today, as does the formerly laid out Market Square in the old Malton village site. So we invite you to explore Old Malton, and please do share your stories and pictures of yesteryear as we try to uncover even more chapters of the story of Old Malton. And we always look forward to particularly the pictures that help show what life in the village was like so many years ago. So please send in your stories and help share the history of the community of Malton. There was indeed a time when Malton sought independence. They wanted to stand on their own 2 feet and felt certainly they could do so. It never happened, but they attempted to at several times. Malton residents felt isolated from the Toronto Township's other villages along Dundas Street, the Credit River, the Lakeshore, etc. The arrival of the airport in 1937 may have only added to that sense of separation, because it was a giant physical entity between Malton and the rest of the township. There were few paved roads and no transit buses linked Malton to the rest of the township. In short, Malton felt neglected, particularly as other parts of the township started to receive new services such as water and sewer and paved roads. During the Second World War, Malton became a busy center of military aircraft production, and with it came a suburban population boom. Malton, as a police village, developed its own tax base, and after several years of being neglected, Malton finally wanted out. The village of Malton was really split into 2 halves. The original village, founded in 1820 and surveyed into village lots in 1855, was entirely west of the 6th concession, which is known today as Airport Road, and within Toronto Township. But with the industrial and economic boom that followed the Second World War, Malton's wartime aircraft production facilities had expanded to the east side of the road into what was then known as Toronto Gore. The 2 sides of Airport Road were in 2 different historic municipalities. The concession lines that define the City of Toronto and the Township of Toronto were surveyed at different times and created a wedge of land, a triangular-shaped piece of land which was known as the Gore. This middle ground became a separate township unto itself. In 1951, Toronto Township applied to the Ontario Municipal Board to annex part of the Gore. The 2 were becoming inseparable. Arenda Engines, the large engine manufacturer that supplied engines to AV Row across the road in Toronto Township, was a major proponent of this unification because of its workers and the tax base it provided. Inversely, workers at Avro were buying homes on the Gore side in what is now Marvin Heights and the Ridgewood Village areas. It only seemed natural that the two should be joined together. In 1954, the Malton Ratepayers Association formed a committee of business and industrial representatives, which were in turn supported by the local aircraft manufacturers, who favored not only annexation of Toronto Gore into Malton, but also independence for the new enlarged Malton. Toronto Township Reeve Anthony Adamson responded with a sense of urgency. The resulting loss of taxes from AV Row plant would bankrupt the Township of Toronto. Deputy Reeve Mary Fix didn't support Malton's incorporation either, but felt that the Reeve Adamson was exaggerating the effects of Malton's independence. She preferred to focus the industrial expansion energies of Toronto Township in Lakeview and in Dixie, which is what would happen at that time. In the meantime, the Ontario Municipal Board agreed that Toronto Township needed Malton, not the other way around. Malton lost its bid for municipal independence in 1954, so it only frustrated ratepayers even more when the Ontario Municipal Board approved the town status for Port Credit in 1961 and Streetsville in 1962. But Malton wasn't done. In 1962, the nearby towns of Long Branch, Mimico, and New Toronto proposed to amalgamate into a Greater Etobicoke, and they reached out to Malton to see if they wanted to join their union. Etobicoke's reason for wanting Malton was obvious. Malton's aviation industries were a huge source of tax revenue. Malton residents knew that Etobicoke just wanted them for their factories, so Malton residents again said no. Malton residents wanted their own independence on their own terms. 3 years later, Toronto Township, which at that point still included Malton, decided that it too wanted to incorporate. In its bid for eventual city status, the township councillors realized that they'd have to change their name. Toronto Township could not become the City of Toronto, since one already existed. The town had to seek for a new name and eventually adopted what we now know as Mississauga. However, Robert Speck, who was Toronto Township Reeve at the time and was a driving force behind incorporation, actually preferred the name Malton. Toronto Township was doing all it could to appease Malton ratepayers, but Malton residents were determined to seek their own status at an upcoming Ontario Municipal Board hearing. Representatives from both Toronto Township and Malton hired lawyers. Malton's stance at the OMB stalled Toronto Township's incorporation hearings well into the 1967 election year. As a result, the name Malton had now been rejected by council. It was off the ballot for renaming the township in 1967. Malton's second attempt at independence in 1967 also failed, and Malton was amalgamated into the new town of Mississauga in 1968 and the city of Mississauga in 1974. And a special hat tip for the information around this segment here to Richard Collins, who explored the topic of Malton's search for independence several years ago. So thank you, Richard, for digging into that story. But the story of Malton and its perceived isolation, or how residents felt at the time of being isolated from the rest of Toronto Township, and Toronto Township not having its best interests at heart, really plays into the story of kind of that forgotten corner of Mississauga that stood on its own 2 feet and wanted to control its own destiny prior to amalgamation. Of course, now it's a treasured part of the city of Mississauga and very much connected into the programs and activities we do here in the city of Mississauga. But there was a time, several times, when Malton sought to become an independent municipality on its own 2 feet. One of my favorite stories around Malton has to do with some of the colorful events and people that helped shape Malton's story over time. And, things like the Calathumpian Parade come to mind when we look at Malton's story. But maybe one of the ones that comes out the most in terms of just an interesting chapter of a story revolves around the person who was responsible for surveying the town site back in 1855, and that being John Stout Dennis. John Stout Dennis lived between 1820 and 1885. As part of the village site was surveyed by Dennis as part of construction of the Grand Trunk Railway, and again, as mentioned, it became a railway town. John Stout Dennis was a noted civil servant and a surveyor by profession. But he drew the ire of many in his lifetime for his conduct as a militia officer in the Fenian raids at the Battle of Ridgeway in 1866 and at the Red River Rebellion in 1870. Despite rigorous investigations into his conduct, during which another officer called him a coward and a poltroonery scoundrel — there's a good name, a poltroonery scoundrel — Dennis enjoyed a long career in the public service. Dennis remained active until his death in 1885. And although he may be remembered as a militia officer who, and we quote, was prone to leap on his horse and ride off in all directions at once, he's also remembered as a prominent public servant and a surveyor. If you'd like to read more about kind of the life and times of John Stout Dennis, and in particular the Fenian raids of 1866, I highly, highly recommend Ridgeway, the American Fenian Invasion in the 1866 Battle That Made Canada by Peter Vronsky. It's one of the finest local history books, or Canadian history books, that I have read, and a truly enjoyable read of a relatively unknown topic in Canadian history. And John Stout Dennis, the person who surveyed Malton a few years before this battle took place, is prominently featured here, and again, highly recommend it. One of my favorite reads that I have undertaken in my many years. So again, highly recommend exploring more stories of Malton and some of the colorful characters and connections that help highlight the history of Malton. Thank you for spending some time with us here at Ask a Historian, and keep sending in your questions as we continue to explore the stories of our city each and every week. There are many different chapters in the story of Malton. In this exploration, we did not touch on some of the fascinating stories of industry and war that have helped shape Malton's history. Victory Aircraft, Victory Village, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, Avro Canada, the Avro Aero, Arenda Engines, and of course the airport itself, and so much more. We really didn't touch on any of those chapters today. But they've all helped shape the fascinating history of Malton for generations. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected with Heritage Mississauga, and continue to follow us here and join us each week for Ask a Historian.